Okay, let's go ahead and come together. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel discussion. I am Gus Hurwitz. I am not Professor Christopher Yu. Christopher had to be down in DC today, so I get the privilege of welcoming you all and introducing our panel. Our panel today is Legal Methods. I'll turn around to read it for Psychedelics, ethical, clinical, and practical implications. I need to do a brief spiel about CTIC, how much we're doing, and encouraging you to come to our other events. I'm actually going to just take a brief moment because I want to focus on the panel, but while I was waiting for our panelists downstairs, I was looking at the schedule of upcoming events, and I thought, wow, a lot of this is CTIC stuff. So that's great. CTIC, Center for Technology, Innovation, and Competition. We have today's event. We have an upcoming conference on Friday, Antitrust at a Crossroads, the Challenge of Digital Platforms. We have other upcoming antitrust and competition-related events. Go to our webpage, find me around the building, send me an email. Happy to talk your ear off about all of that. But our focus for today is our panel, and I'm going to briefly introduce Professor Holly Fernandez-Lynch, who will introduce our panelists and take over our discussion. Professor Fernandez-Lynch is an assistant professor of medical ethics and assistant faculty director of online education at the Department of Medical Ethics at the Perelman School of Medicine. She does a lot of stuff. The most important thing from my perspective is she works with the law school. She's affiliated faculty with CTIC. Yes, I'm going to come back to that again. And we love working with her and her colleagues to put together interdisciplinary events at this intersection and working to develop programming events, research opportunities for faculty and students. Holly, with that, I will hand things to you.
I think we're going to share this.
Perfect. Love that.
So right off the bat, I'm going to shirk my moderator duties because I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves. We'll go right down the line. But thank you all for being here. We're going to make sure that we have a robust discussion today, and there will be lots of time before the end of the event for questions. So please keep track of what you want to ask our esteemed panelists.
And just into the intros and the spiel.
Just intros.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. How's everyone doing? Yeah, happy Wednesday. Glad to be here. Really excited to be in this conversation with the co-panelists and with you all. Thanks for making it. My name is Ismail Lorido Ali. I also go by Izzy. I'm based in Oakland, California on the West Coast. I do a little bit of a lot of different things, but right now I'm working as the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Bunch of syllables, also known as MAPS. MAPS has been working for the last 38, I think we're about to hit years, in the world of research, science education about psychedelics, with its flagship project being working toward the FDA approval of MDMA-assisted psychedelic therapy for PTSD. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. I've worked with a bunch of different orgs in the ecosystem over the years, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, the Chacruna Institute, and co-founded the Psychedelic Bar Association a few years ago to support the education and kind of cultural orientation of legal professionals in the space. And love this field. I'm grateful to be able to talk about it in a lot of different directions, and excited to have this conversation here with you all.
He's interesting, warm, and lovely. I, by contrast, am a law professor. So my name is Glenn Cohen. I'm a professor at Harvard Law School, and I also I do a lot of work in various parts of health law and bioethics. I am the faculty director for the Petrie Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. And most relevant for this, I also am on the faculty of POPLAR, which is the project on psychedelic law and regulation. And we do publications on the topic and analyses in medical journals, law journals, science journals, and the like.
There we go.
Hey, everybody. Any nursing students here? I heard there might be some. Yeah. Shout out to you. I'm Dr. Natalie Gukasian. I'm a psychiatrist and a researcher. I'm at Columbia right now. I did my training back at Hopkins, where I stayed for a postdoc working at what soon became the Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, where I got the chance to be both a clinician and sort of more of an administrative role in a lot of these research studies and actually crunching the numbers and writing the papers. So I've sat with a lot of patients who are under the influence of psilocybin. I've thought a lot about all the issues that might affect them clinically. I'm interested very much in how this is all going to roll out in the real world. And I was a medical director there at the Hopkins Center before coming over to Columbia, where I'm now an assistant professor. And I'm doing sort of half clinical work and half research. My clinical work now is in our interventional program, where we offer treatments like ketamine and brain stimulation. And the research I'm sort of figuring out a little bit more, but I'm hoping to continue doing some clinical trials using psilocybin, other psychedelics, things like that. Interested in a lot of stuff. Among the other things I'm interested in is education and just sort of how we train people who might be involved in this on the ground, who should be involved, how should they be involved. So I'm excited to be here to chat with you all today.
Last and least. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, well, call them like I say them. I'm Steve Levine. I'm also a psychiatrist, although you can't tell because I'm not wearing my sweater vest tonight. And I am the Senior Vice President for Patient Access and Medical Affairs for Compass Pathways. Compass is a biotechnology company that's conducting clinical trials to investigate the use of COMP360 psilocybin treatment, which is a synthetic form of psilocybin delivered along with psychological support for a range of indications with large unmet need. We received FDA Breakthrough Therapy designation in 2018 for our first investigational indication, which is treatment-resistant depression, which is a major depressive disorder for which patients have been failed by between 2 and 4 treatments within their current episode. And we have earlier stage programs in PTSD as well as anorexia nervosa. I've been with Compass for a few years now, about 3.5 years. Prior to that, I spent a decade on the provider side of the world. Back in 2010, I founded and over the next decade led a national mental health services company that focused on delivering new models of care for innovative treatments in psychiatry. In 2010, that started with ketamine, ultimately treating several thousand patients within locations across 8 states around the country. And then in latter days, really focusing more on directly FDA-approved treatments that were covered by insurance with an eye towards creating broad and equitable patient access for new treatments, especially those who are not well served with the existing standard of care. And so it's that experience that I bring into Compass, where I largely focus on issues of implementation and the challenges of implementation for novel treatments should we gain FDA approval, as well as medical education. So a pleasure to be here with all of you and with my co-panelists, and look forward to this discussion.
Well, what we thought we would do is recognizing that there are lots of different backgrounds and background understanding of the psychedelic landscape in the room, that we would kind of start out with some opening statements from our panelists that are intended to kind of get us all on the same page about some core domains relevant to psychedelics. So I'm going to start with you, Natalie. If you could just kind of talk us through what is it that we know whirlwind tour about psychedelic therapies from a scientific and clinical perspective, and what are the critical unresolved questions?
Yeah. All right. So like the 2-minute tour of the entirety of clinical research history. It's probably you, actually, but I'll stick with me. So people have been using psychedelics for a very long time, probably thousands of years, in all sorts of different ways. Clinicians, researchers didn't really pay too much mind in a big and concerted way probably until like the 1950s to 1970s, where we had this first wave of psychedelic research during which tens of thousands of patients got dosed with LSD and psilocybin. Despite that, the quality of the research that came out of that time was very poor. It didn't lead to very much in the way of any sort of, approval for clinical use of those medications. And then we had all this sort of like cultural backlash and political stuff and turmoil that led to the government sort of shutting down any kind of human subjects research with psychedelics. That was until probably the very late 90s. And so we're probably about 25 years into what is now the second wave, or the psychedelic renaissance. In the earlier part of this period, there were a lot of very highly controlled, small clinical trials starting in healthy people, gradually showing some safety and some positive effects for mood and behavior change and things that look pretty interesting. They got researchers wondering if maybe those effects could be extended to clinical populations for some clinical benefit. And so gradually there have been more and more studies looking at people with depression, anxiety, PTSD. And we're now at a very interesting time. And you might probably have more to say about this, right, and sort of how this is rolling out and the approval process for these drugs. But we're now at a time where we have completed phase 3 trials for MDMA. The new drug application was submitted in December, actually, and so now we're in this period where within about 60 days, the FDA is going to tell us whether the application is going to be reviewed in an expedited way over the course of 6 months or the regular way, which is 10 months. So by that time, we might have an answer from the FDA about whether MDMA is going to be rescheduled and potentially available for clinical use. So MDMA is often called ecstasy, Molly, that kind of stuff. So it's an amphetamine derivative. It's not a classical psychedelic, so there's a little bit of difference in the pharmacology of the mechanism of action of MDMA compared to things like LSD and psilocybin that work primarily with a specific kind of neurotransmitter receptor activation. But the subjective effects of MDMA and psilocybin and LSD have some overlap, and so all of them can produce these big, profound subjective experiences that are often highly meaningful or maybe even spiritual for some people and are associated with all these nice longer-term benefits that we see. So we've all been waiting for this moment for a very long time. We're all very excited on the clinical side and the research side about what's going to happen, We're also terrified. We're terrified. I don't know about you, Steve. Yeah. I'm scared. That's the right word. We're scared because I think there are so many unanswered questions right now about what this is actually going to look like in the real world, because the models that were used in all the clinical trials I mentioned so far have been very labor-intensive, time-intensive in a way that probably is not realistic for the real world. I'm talking about 2 therapists per patient with many, many hours of therapy before, during, after. Super expensive, unlikely that insurance payers are going to cover that kind of treatment. And if we don't have it, what does that mean for patients who are going to be receiving this? How much therapy is ideal? We don't really know that either. Should people get dosed again if they fail treatment or if they relapse? We don't have a good answer for that. Hopefully we will soon. So there are a lot of open questions, but we're sort of on the brink of at least one of these so-called psychedelic drugs being approved. The other medication probably is psilocybin that people are interested in. So Compass is one of the entities who's pursuing approval for psilocybin for an indication of treatment-resistant depression. There's also USONA, who Hopkins was a site for, so I participated in one of those trials as one of the site investigators. And so they're also looking to approve psilocybin for an indication of depression as well. They're a little bit behind the MDMA folks. But it's possible that maybe within, 2 to 4 years, we've been saying that for 2 to 4 years, that 2 to 4 years from now, that this would be maybe approved. So we're about to see it. I don't know if we're totally ready exactly, but many people are champing at the bit to sort of get going. The other thing I didn't mention is ketamine, which is an entire whole separate situation, right? That exists in this kind of legal gray area in many ways because it has some psychedelic properties at certain doses, but it's not ketamine. Racemic ketamine is not FDA approved for depression, but it's being used in many clinics in that way. I could go on, but I'm going to stop my spiel there because I think it's been a few minutes.
Great. Okay, so next I'm going to ask Ismail to talk to us about what are the current legal models for psychedelics in the United States.
It's a super fun topic. Thank you. And thank you. Maybe one really quick thing that I should say before I go into this, just about MDMA and ecstasy. MDMA is best described as the active ingredient in ecstasy. Ecstasy is actually a catch-all term for a drug that usually contains maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 ingredients that has changed a lot over the years. So ecstasy is more of a slang street term, which may or may not be accurate because most people, when they actually go through the MDMA treatment process, find it not very ecstatic. Maybe they have an ecstatic moment, but it's actually quite challenging to go through the process of kind of interrogating, confronting, and transmuting trauma. So not to say that the dealers misnamed it, but just to say that there's a little bit of a hair worth splitting here, just when it comes to describing exactly what drug is getting through, that is being, was submitted for the new drug application, and what ecstasy is, which is a whole bunch of things. So I'll talk a little bit about a few different models. I appreciate Natalie for giving the context and where we're at, especially with the medical FDA-approved or potentially FDA-approved models, and also the kind of, I think, key issue related to ketamine, which is off-label use, and like how to navigate the existence of an on-label ketamine treatment, which exists right now, Spravato, as well as off-label practices, which kind of vary based on modality and who's offering the treatment and so on. So I'll speak a little bit to everything that's not the medical use system. That's a lot of what I've been working on over the last few years at MAPS, which kind of can be maybe simplified into a few different categories. One being decriminalization, which is as simple as the elimination or reduction of criminal penalties. Many of you here are probably familiar with what we call the history of the war on drugs. MDMA came a little bit later, so the Controlled Substances Act was passed in 1971. A number of drugs were included in that. A number of drugs had already been controlled at the state and even federal level prior to that point, but the existence of the Controlled Substances Act kind of consolidated all of the drug control scheme. And there's a long spiel history of what led to that point, which maybe I won't get into now, but if people are interested in the Q&A, if you want like the 5-minute, 500-year history of the war on drugs, I'm happy to give it. But what I'll say is that alongside the kind of medical expansion, the research expansion, which is leading to these potential medical pathways, there's been interest in what else is going on. Well over 90, 95, maybe 99% of people who've used psychedelics, certainly in the last 50 years, have done so outside of medical and clinical settings. And there's a certain level of risk reduction, harm reduction, just like realism, in my opinion, to looking at other legal models because it's how people have been using them. So it's kind of a sort of meeting people where they're at sort of approach. So there has been a move to decriminalize, reduce, or eliminate criminalization or penalties at the municipal, state, not so much at the federal level, but there has been movement internationally over the years to kind of reduce criminalization and look, maybe put simply, a treatment, not jail approach, put very, very kind of simply. And that's been followed. There's been some movement in Oregon and at the municipal level in different cities to kind of reduce penalties or reduce risks for personal use. What's maybe one note to say here that's different between the decriminalization of psychedelics that's, I would say, differentiated from the decriminalization of other drugs in the conversation is that when we're talking about the decriminalization of other drugs, and this is true in places like Czech Republic and Portugal that have like legal decriminalization schemes throughout the country, is that those schemes generally just look at personal use and possession, whereas a lot of the conversations around psychedelic decriminalization tend to expand just a little bit more to personal cultivation and non-commercial sharing. So there's kind of a slightly larger umbrella, legally speaking, for what kinds of activities might be protected by a criminalization or decriminalization scheme, which gives us a little bit of maybe like clues into what future movements might look like. So I'll pause there, but we can go more into that if desired. The other thing that is kind of a helpful term, but maybe not, is legalization. That's actually a massive umbrella of a term that means a whole bunch of different things to different people. When I think of legalization, I think of the kind of cognizing of the state in some sort of legal or regulatory framework. So you might say that medicalization under an FDA-approved scheme in relation to state boards is a form of legalization, albeit for a limited patient population. But people usually use the term a little bit broadly, and maybe two examples that we've seen are maybe what y'all have heard of in states like Oregon or Colorado, where they have kind of closed loops legal regulatory systems where the state kind of licenses and regulates everything tip to tail from cultivation to manufacture to delivery to transportation to sale and so on, also with different restrictions based on how exactly they want to kind of narrow or broaden the aperture of people who get access, depending on different factors. One key note there is that, generally speaking, these state programs, while many of them campaigned on kind of a therapeutic use model, I would argue in legal language are a little bit closer to a state-regulated services model. And one simple way to think about that is that a medical model might, at least for now, until we get to an elective use paradigm, which maybe we'll get to in this conversation or not, has a floor, that floor being a diagnosis. And until you have a diagnosis that qualifies under an approved drug that may or may not get permission through the FDA, then you're not really going to get access to that point. Again, I don't need a diagnosis to get normal therapy. I can just go to a therapist. I don't actually need a diagnosis to get invasive surgery like cosmetic surgery to my face, but you still need to have some sort of barriers to entry. So there are medical procedures that don't necessarily have those barriers to entry before now, and in the initial round, we anticipate that kind of floor for medically approved treatments. The difference between that and state-level programs, these services are, I don't really love the word wellness, but you can kind of characterize that as a sort of wellness model, is that it's more of a ceiling. In those environments, all adults 21 and up are presumed permitted to participate in the system up to and until they have some sort of contraindication. One of the big legal questions and kind of structural questions that continues to exist is how exactly do you interact, how exactly does a legal state program interact with a federally legal or federally licensed person? So how does a doctor with a DEA license interact with a program that's legal at the state level but still remains illegal at the federal level? Maybe we'll go more into some of the scope of practice stuff later on. But those kind of interactions are what really comes up. So that state legal kind of closed loop model is what we're seeing in Colorado and Oregon. And notably in Colorado, they're actually doing both at the same time, where they decriminalize the personal use, creating effectively kind of this like leeway for unregulated practice to a certain extent, as well as are in the process of pre-implementation of what a regulated use program might look like. Very briefly, I'll touch on one other thing, which is religious or spiritual practice. This is really its own category relative to these other ones. Generally regulated primarily at the federal level, which is where the bulk of religious protections exist, but many states have implemented either in their constitution or in religious freedom acts additional protections, usually really groundwork laid by the Native American Church. For those that aren't familiar, that's like 130-year or 400-year history, depending on how you're counting, of legal jurisprudence that led to the protection of, in particular, peyote used by Native Americans within the United States that were then extended in the Supreme Court case in 2006, and then also reiterated in a Ninth Circuit case in 2009 for 2 ayahuasca churches. That's a whole rabbit hole of a conversation. We could spend 2 hours just on that, but the key takeaway here is that semi-quasi-protection of religious practice, because it's the version of maybe protected use that looks the most, like there might have the most room, like it might have the most protection, and I would say it has the biggest gray area, is where you see a lot of people expanding into attempts at legal practice or quasi-legal practice prior to getting into a lot of the medical use that we'll be talking about here. Whether or not there's an interaction between these medical and spiritual systems, I think is more of an ontological and a cosmological question, which maybe we can get into in the Q&A. But I just want to name that these things do interact, even though they do kind of touch on different elements of society, perception, and so on. I think that's good for now, right? Great. Okay.
Thank you. So Steve, I'm going to ask you now to kind of talk through the business model for psychedelic drug development and what are some of the core issues in promoting equitable patient access in that context.
Happy to, and glad I'm following Izzy's remarks. First of all, that was an amazing and succinct whistle-stop tour of the breadth of legal models. And so I can now pick up on a couple of the threads of what you were discussing, because we at Compass are pursuing one of those many models that Izzy just described to you, which is a medical model. And I would like to first say that, I fully acknowledge that there are many potential models, there are many potential routes to access. In emphasizing the medical model, in that being the route that Compass is pursuing for our Comp 360, it's not to say that other models shouldn't exist, that one is better than another. These will ultimately, 5-10 years from now, whatever the time frame may be, exist in parallel, side by side, representing solutions for different people with different needs in different settings, et cetera. And so I'm going to be going into why it is specifically and how we are approaching this medical model and what the business model is around that, to answer Holly's question. And for that, one thing that may help frame some of that consideration, I'm glad, Izzy, that you brought up some existing examples of medical treatments that don't necessarily require a diagnosis. You mentioned cosmetic surgery, therapy. What's also true, though, is if you want somebody else to pay for those services, typically an insurance carrier, typically a diagnosis is required. And something that's really at the forefront of our minds at Compass is broad and equitable patient access. And it really is the reason why we are pursuing this particular medical pathway. So to define that medical model further, and I touched on this a bit in my introductory remarks, We are conducting research and development on COMP360. That is a proprietary synthetic formulation. It's a crystalline polymorph of psilocybin, the active ingredient in so-called magic mushrooms. So our product is not derived from mushrooms. We like to joke that no mushrooms are harmed in the course of conducting our research. And because of the unique subjective properties of ingesting, it's an oral capsule, ingesting a substance like psilocybin, it is administered in a controlled and monitored medical setting, accompanied by a therapist who's been trained in a model to support your psychological and physical safety during that experience, and to meet with you before and afterwards to prepare you for that, as well as to follow up on your safety and further planning after the experience itself. We are pursuing this for an FDA approval. For that approval, we need to demonstrate in our trials sufficient safety and efficacy. Right now, we are in phase 3 trials. This is the last stage of research prior to the submission of the NDA that Natalie mentioned earlier, that MAPS just submitted for their program with MDMA. It will take us another couple of years to conclude those trials, and so we still are 2-3 years away from a potential FDA approval and making this available to patients by prescription. This is intended, if approved, to be prescribed by appropriately licensed and trained healthcare providers, to be delivered within the existing healthcare system, and covered, reimbursed by both commercial and government payers, insurers. I will be the first to acknowledge that we do not have a perfect healthcare system in this country. That's probably not a controversial statement. But north of 90% of Americans are covered by some form of health insurance, and most do rely upon that health insurance to accept, afford, and access their care. And as I said, we are ultimately focused on broad and equitable access for those patients for whom we've demonstrated within our trials may benefit from our treatment. And we want to make sure that at the federal level, this is available to them. And so the process there is that if FDA does approve this treatment, then it would move to DEA, who has 90 days to recommend rescheduling for the drug. So just a moment on that. Izzy mentioned earlier the Controlled Substances Act, which was in 1971. This placed various drugs on one of 5 schedules. Schedule 1 is illegal. There is no approved medical use, and there is the highest risk of abuse, misuse, divergence, etc., and harm. Moving down to Schedule 5, where on that continuum there is the least risk. We don't know yet if MDMA or psilocybin or any other psychedelic is FDA approved, which schedule it may be placed on, but by definition, if there's now an approved medical use, it will need to be rescheduled. From there, it moves to each of the 50 states, who also need to reschedule the drug. In about half of states, that happens relatively automatically. There are trigger laws where they follow federal guidance. In the other states, it requires a bit more work with either administrative or legislative action to reschedule it. But as you can hear, this is a very long process with no guarantee that we make it to the end and actually are able to present a new option to the patients who are waiting. I certainly feel the time pressure of that as a psychiatrist, as a human being, as somebody who has many people in his life who might potentially benefit from this treatment, as somebody who's had his own experience. Ultimately, because our focus is on people with diagnosed mental illness and wanting to make sure that this is an affordable option for them, we know of no other way to shortcut that. And so we continue on that path, and I know I've been talking for a while now, so I will shut up and hand back over to Holly.
Great. Okay, so Glenn, now I'm going to turn to you to do what you do best, which is bring all these threads together and talk to us about how the law and ethics come together when we're thinking about access to and oversight of psychedelic drugs.
Great. Going last, I can be a little bit briefer on some of these things, but also I have the opportunity to really stir the pot a little bit, so I'm going to look forward to that, right? So let me bucket things in 4 buckets in terms of the law and ethics of this. The first is questions about research ethics and trial design, so what FDA is currently reviewing. Actually, there is a meeting today with a lot of FDA people and tomorrow, I think. And this includes, like, in a trial, what is the appropriate control, placebos, active placebos, how good are they? Questions about which disorders are appropriate and whether, as an ethical matter, we're targeting the right stuff, and is it, why are we focusing on this rather than that? And here I think the politics are very interesting in that actually psychedelics are a bipartisan issue, in part because of the large active duty service member and veterans populations interested in some of these things. Then questions about, for example, FDA has taken the position, and I've criticized them on this, that feelings of euphoria or hallucinogenic experiences as part of these treatments should be thought of as abuse-related adverse events. That's like something that's a problem for these trials, right? Whereas you might say, why is that a problem? Why is that something we consider an adverse event if it's part of a therapeutic process or if some patients view it that way? So that's one bucket. Second bucket, equity and access, and Steve mentioned this a little bit. So insurance is a huge piece of this because this might be very expensive depending on how it's structured. And how is it the case that if you build it, will it necessarily get paid for by public and private coverers? A second, though, way of thinking about this is a question about intellectual property, right? So Compass, for example, has patented their substance. When we're talking about some of these substances out there in the world, the naturally occurring versions, they are probably unpatentable. Some people think some of the attempts to patent some of this should also be unpatentable. But there's a real trade-off as you think about this as a designer of a system between the immense costs it takes to get something to have FDA approval and who's going to pay for that if you don't have any intellectual property over the substance, and how to think about that. And the ecosystem of for-profit, B corporations, nonprofits in this space, I think it's super, super interesting. Another piece of this, though, is what we owe those who came before us, and the fact that much of this is, some of this, at least in some of these substances, are derived from, centuries of indigenous practice. And what does that carry forward in terms of obligations, both legally enforceable or CSR obligations to indigenous populations, for example, as well as acknowledgement and respect for those practices? And how do we dilute and make it problematic if we transmogrify what is a ritualistic practice into a therapeutic practice that is a medical thing? Or, as in some of the early trials, is it really important to create a ritual around this? And is that a way of paying homage and respect, or is that a way of kind of cosplaying indigenous kind of ritualism? Third is just the clinical side of this and thinking about how clinicians are going to actually deal with this in the real life. And there I want to kind of talk about the questions of credentials. Is this going to be psychotherapists? Is this going to be MDs? Is it going to be people who have a separate kind of training, facilitator training? What does that look like? How many of them are going to be in the room? Questions about what is appropriate to do or not do in a session. So there have been allegations regarding sexual abuse or inappropriate touching, and how do we think about regulating the boundaries of that? Questions about what the informed consent ought to look like for undergoing this as a clinical matter. How do we talk to people about an experience that might be mystical, spiritual, but very heterogeneous, where many people might be disappointed that they thought this was going to see something that had meaning to them, and in fact they feel nothing. How do we talk about this heterogeneity of this experience, and are there other analogs and other kinds of medicine? And then questions about scope of practice and questions about diversion. So how does a system that allows prescription off-label, how does that intersect if a state doesn't want to decriminalize, doesn't want to have supported adult use, but wants to keep a tight lid on the rest of the market? We've seen this, I think, with ketamine as an interesting case study with some of the, I'll call them pill mills involved in mailing out ketamine. Is that something we have to think about, and how do we do that? And how does the way FDA designs the label, the indication, what are called REMSs, so risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, which is now in the news relating to mifepristone and the abortion case, which is kind of an additional layer of protection and control. Okay. Last thing to say is just what about beyond all this, thinking about the regular population, what about special populations? So some of the early work by Roland Griffith is on cancer patients facing the end of life. Do end of life populations deserve either special solicitude and more access, or are they more of concern when we think about using this for somebody who's in their last period of living? What do we think about a potential future where pediatric patients with treatment-resistant depression want to have access to this therapy, right? Is that appropriate? Is that not appropriate? Does FDA need to insist on a trial involving pediatric patients, and how do we think about that? And then lastly, I just want to return, as you mentioned this, to the religious communities, because there's a way in which you might think of these as separate streams, but also in a weird way, somewhat competing streams, right? These are communities that in some ways, part of the attraction of these communities has been the specialness of having access to these kind of mystical experiences in Socratic religions and other kinds of religions as well. And in a world where the suburban mom is doing this before dropping the kids off to soccer, and you're going to your once-a-month purging ritual full of a lot of ritualism to it with ayahuasca, with an ayahuasquero, how does our kind of conception of this and our conception of these two experiences, how do they merge? How do they compete? How do we think about that? We'll stop there.
Great. I love that imagery. So I wanted to give the panelists just the opportunity to briefly respond to any of what you heard in these kind of opening statements before we get on to some of our other questions for you all.
Fun. That was great. Good job, everyone. That was like a really solid, like dense download of like a lot of information. So I'll just maybe respond to two quick things. I think, well, and I'll flag that the informed consent issue is a really interesting one that I won't touch on in my own comments right now, but I think is worth diving into because the question of how to consent to something that's very hard to explain and that's arguably kind of by definition impossible to put into words is like a very interesting, just kind of larger issue that is a whole rabbit hole that maybe we'll get into later. But I'll just touch on two quick things, and I'm sorry if I'm stealing the opportunity to do this from someone else, but I want to talk about bifurcated scheduling, which is everyone's favorite topic. And then also the bipartisanism of psychedelics from a political sense. So first on the rescheduling thing, having come from the lens of drug policy reform before I joined this field of psychedelics a number of years ago, a big kind of motivating factor for a lot of people in the movement prior to their existing in industry was really this question of criminalization and how psychedelics fall into kind of the current drug control scheme, and in particular how it falls into kind of what we know today as the capital W, capital D war on drugs. The dynamics of that are very different with psychedelics. The numbers are fewer. We don't see, unlike cannabis, methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, increasingly fentanyl, you don't have like a single population of currently identifiable high volume people who have been impacted by criminalization in the same way with most psychedelics. People do get arrested, but the rates are much lower. I think that all the psychedelics put together is like reaches up to a single percent. If you add MDMA, it's another like 8%, federally speaking. And of course, for the states, it varies. So I say that to say that like the movement toward creating legal access to psychedelics in different ways may or may not have the same kind of significant criminal justice downstream impact that we might see from a conversation about decriminalizing or legalizing the other classes of drugs that people see as kind of more socially stigmatized and harmful, whether or not that's accurate. But the reason I bring that up is because when thinking about this kind of advancement from a kind of medical treatment access perspective, which is a lot of what we talked about, a big motivation for a lot of us in the drug policy reform movement is also thinking about criminalization and the impacts of that. So when, to the point that, I agree with the point that was made earlier, if it is true, if FDA does find that there is any sort of medical value with MDMA or any other psychedelic, it would no longer qualify for Schedule 1. And maybe I'll withhold my editorializing on this, but there are also examples of drugs that exist in multiple schedules or versions of drugs that exist in multiple schedules. The most basic example is cannabis, which is in Schedule 1, but there are 4 or 5 cannabis-derived drugs, some of which are organically derived and some of them are synthetically derived from THC or CBD that exist in other schedules. Of course, you can differentiate those, but I bring up this term bifurcated scheduling to recognize that, to clarify, even if FDA were to find MDMA or psilocybin or LSD, frankly, or DMT or any of these to have a medical value, that I think it's very possible that the uncontrolled version of that drug would stay in Schedule 1, and that a drug product, which maybe someone here could define better than I could, but a drug product, which is the FDA-approved kind of package, might end up in a schedule other than Schedule 1. So I want to clarify that like it won't be that MDMA would be pulled out of Schedule 1, but then MDMA might stay in Schedule 1, and then an FDA-approved drug product, if that exists, with all the bells and whistles, including the REMS that Glenn was talking about, might end up in a schedule other than Schedule 1. So I want to clarify that. The reason I started with the drug policy piece is because while it is true that Schedule 1 drugs and some Schedule 2 drugs tend to have higher criminal penalties, drugs like methamphetamine, cocaine, and others exist on Schedule 2, drugs that we now know fairly well, especially psilocybin is a great example, that have many fewer kind of physical health effects and social detrimental effects, remain in Schedule 1. So we're kind of at this point where, in my opinion, the scheduling system has kind of outstayed its welcome, and the evidence base that's used to determine that may be delayed in updating. So I actually think that the more we start to see some of these shifts, we might actually start to have to review and take a larger macro look at how exactly we determine social positionality and danger, relative danger of a drug in general. So that's one thing. And then the other is about the bipartisanship of the issue. I'm sure a lot of people have seen this. When I started working at MAPS and going out to DC, it was like me and like a 6'2" military vet, Army and Marine vet. So it's like, we're really like a motley crew. I'm out there like with long hair and earrings, and this dude is like an all-star American kind of soldier. But it's funny because like the reality is that, and I think part of the reason it's so bipartisan does have to do with kind of the sympathetic perspective of many Americans to veterans in particular, but also I would say that one other big change that's led to that has to do with the shift of our understanding of mental health more broadly. I think 10 years ago even, there were still enough people who held enough shame around how they thought about mental health that it was still somewhat hard to talk about in public. I think that in the last 10 years, there's been such an opening, both because of the desperation and need and like the visible reality of what's happening and the lack of social services and so on. A lot of people could, have opinions about this as to why it is. But the reality is that I think right now that most Americans, most people in their families have been impacted by some sort of mental health issue, whether it's depression or more often substance use disorders, alcoholism, suicide, and the like. And that just means that we're not really having to convince people that mental health is like a thing we should take seriously anymore. That's something that's now kind of hit a zeitgeist. So I think that the bipartisan issue is both because we're like, oh, everyone thinks that like frontline healthcare workers and veterans should have access to care. But it's also that like everybody has like a grandson or a cousin or a sibling that's been impacted by substance use disorders of some kind. And I think that generally just makes it easier for people to realize that we actually have the opportunity to talk about something outside of a political paradigm. I think it's not too late. It still can become politicized, and I think that a lot of the work that we're doing in the advocacy world is to not just make it bipartisan. I like to say multi-partisan because there's multiple shades on multiple sides. And I don't like saying depoliticized because everything has some sort of political element, but it is true that this like human suffering element does transcend that. And there's a certain way where we can talk about that, and it does allow for a little tiny teensy-weensy bit more of humanity to come into the conversation, which doesn't always exist with drugs in general. The fact that it has less baggage, the fact that not everyone knows what MDMA is, but everyone knows what weed is, and weed's got 25, 30 years of political baggage, all that stuff really makes a difference.
I want to react to that last thing you said too, which is to say that we should openly acknowledge the racialized aspect of this too, and that towards the populations that are users and that are targeted. I want to, again, I promised that I'd make it spicy, so I want to make it a little bit spicy. And one thing that I think is interesting is that, so there are businesses involved here, right? So I'm like, business is going to business. That's what they're supposed to do. Corporations, they have a corporate form for a reason. One of the most interesting questions being fought about right now, I think, in the literature is whether to understand this as part of a psychotherapeutic paradigm versus kind of a drug therapy sort of paradigm. And why do I say that, right? There's people who believe this should only be the case once you've had many hours of therapy before, many hours of therapy after a pre-existing therapeutic relationship. And then there's other folks who think that no, the right term, and Steve used this term, is psychosocial support, that we have scaffolding around it, but it's not going to be administered as part of a long-term therapeutic plan. And that's important because it changes how much you can sell, but also changes the cost, because the more hours of therapy you add on to it, the more costly it's going to become. So this is just I don't have a dog in this fight, but just observing it has been very interesting how this, as we've gotten closer to approval, this particular issue I think has gotten more and more salient and more discussed.
So I will just kind of pick up on one thing that you mentioned, Ismail, which is, FDA approves specific drug products from a specific sponsor for a specific indication. And so, if MAPS MDMA gets approved, that does not mean that all MDMA is FDA approved, or that it can be sold and have claims made about it that go above and beyond the FDA regulated approval. And so it's related to the bifurcated scheduling, but this is not a free-for-all the minute FDA approves one version of one psychedelic substance. Okay, I wanted to just kind of now move into some of the kind of questions that we had planned to discuss, making sure that we have plenty of time for audience questions. So let me pose a question both to Natalie and Glenn together. You can kind of, shoot odds or evens for who's going to respond first. But the question is, what are some of the legal and ethical challenges that are unique to psychedelic research compared to other types of clinical research that might be conducted?
So as a clinician, having been in the room, and I'm in that fight, the one that you mentioned. Maybe you read our response to the letter from your organization. So I can talk about that too, but certainly informed consent is an issue, as Ismail brought up. Consenting somebody for an experience that is by definition ineffable is a very challenging thing to do. What are we required to disclose to patients? I can also tell you the difference between a consent in the clinic versus in a research setting is very different, right? So in the research setting, we'll spend hours consenting a person, making sure they understand every single line of what we put in there. In the clinic, I think thinking back to like a recent visit I had where consenting for like a major surgery was like a 2-minute thing, right? Where like I can consent to that, right? Even though I might not actually understand what it'll be like if I was going for an amputation, right? Spiritually or psychologically, I might never know what it's like to have my arm cut off, but I can consent to it, and that's okay. So I think in some ways the psychedelic consent mystery is a little bit like that, where maybe we don't need to explain fully everything. We just sort of say that these are the kinds of drug effects that can occur. Some of it is difficult to describe. Some of it maybe it would be helpful to talk to somebody who's experienced it to get a better understanding, which is related to another debate about should therapists have their own personal experience as part of training. Another fun realm of things we can talk about. Touch is a big issue. I can't forget who touched on touch, but we're going to touch on it again right now. In a lot of the earlier studies, so touch was, in some cases, it wasn't even like protocolized. No one actually wrote down in the protocol like, oh, therapists can offer touch to participants who are experiencing some distress or whatever during a drug experience. But in many cases, it is offered. I've seen it written down in some therapy manuals, right? And it's usually limited to something like holding a hand or holding a person, placing a hand on the shoulder. But you can imagine, right, that under the influence of a very potent psychoactive drug, your thoughts and feelings about being touched might be vastly different, and that can go either way, right? Maybe with MDMA, which is an entactogen, it sort of creates these warm, fuzzy feelings. A person who ordinarily hates to be touched would really love to be touched and might request that, or might be feeling emotionally overwhelmed and really benefit from that, yet a day before was saying that under no circumstances did he want to be touched. And so what does the therapist do in that situation? We don't have a ton of great guidelines. At Hopkins, our solution was to have a weekly group supervision where all of anybody who had any kind of clinical involvement would get together and in painstaking detail discuss these cases and how the person felt and how we felt and what did we do and oh my God, and should we have done a different thing. That kind of thing would be great to have in the real world, right? Some sort of like supervision that people could attend to get some kind of feedback in that way. So touch, informed consent are issues in the research space. In terms of barriers to research, I think that was sort of much more of an issue in the very early part of the second wave of the psychedelic renaissance, right, where the regulatory agencies like FDA, DEA were very resistant to approving any kind of protocols for human studies involving psychedelics. I think that's kind of changed now. It's just as annoying now to get an approval for a psychedelic study as it is to for any new drug, which is great. And this isn't really an ethical issue, but funding for studies with psychedelics has been a problem, and that was part of the reason why none of this happened for many decades. Clinical trials are very expensive. On the order of hundreds of thousands just to run something like 20 participants for a very simple study design. And to this day, the major funding organizations like the NIH are a little bit reluctant to provide funding for those trials. And so as a result, a lot of the newer trials, and especially a lot of the larger trials, are being funded by entities like Compass and MAPS, for better or for worse, right? And so they obviously have financial interests in the game. So it's not that there's none, but there's very little. I can think of a couple of situations that are an exception to that, one being a recent study funded by NIDA looking at psilocybin for tobacco use disorder. Another colleague of mine got his career development award, sort of an early career award, to look at psilocybin for OCD. But really, the NIH tends to be more interested in sort of mechanistic studies, preclinical things, a trial where you're going to have some, you hope to have some outcome that will tell you something about how and why this works.
Department of Defense just gave $10 million. Sorry, the Department of Defense has received $10 million.
Love to hear it. That's great. So things are changing, right? And I'll hand it over to you because it's been a minute, but I'm sure you have lots
Yeah,
to say.
I don't have that much to add beyond what she said and what I've said before.
Button again.
Oh, sorry. I don't. I'll just talk about it. I don't have that much to add based on what I've said before. Maybe live with the microphone, actually. Who knows? Okay, or point it to more, would be even better. All I was going to say, I forgot what I was going to say. All I was going to say beyond this is just a question. I think the most interesting question is, what is it we're trying to measure, and why are we trying to measure that and not something else? And what do I mean by that? Is that, you've got scores for depression, scores, the PTSD, and within a truly medicalized model, you think, okay, that's success. I see it 6 months, 12 months, different scores. That's the outcome I should be losing. But you also care about whether somebody's neighbors and friends think that they are different, that they view the world differently, that they have a peace with their mortality, or are these the kinds of things we should be factoring out? Not only do we not care about it, there are actually negatives or problems in terms of thinking about the therapy. And this is now the question about whether we view these as essentially treatments for a disorder versus gateways to experience, or gateways to, I know you don't like the word, wellness, or a different way of living. And I just think that those are radically different epistemologies, and how you design the trial will tell you one thing or the other, and how you review the trial will tell you one thing or the other.
Okay, so the next question I wanted to pose was for Steve and Ismail, who have experience on the business side of psychedelic drug development. And so one of the things that sometimes happens when you have a lot of hype about a product is that people are really excited to get access to it. And there is a method to provide access to unapproved drugs that are working their way through the FDA system. You might have heard of it called compassionate use, or expanded access is the term that FDA uses. And I'm wondering, from a business perspective, how do you decide whether to make the product that you're developing, the psychedelic product that you're developing, available to people outside of trials before FDA approval comes?
Yeah, here we go. It's a great question. So Holly, you touched on the hype that exists around psychedelics right now. There is a lot of hope, there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of myth and lore around psychedelics right now. And in part, that's great. I think it's really important that, people who might otherwise feel hopeless have some reassurance that, people are working on new options for them. There might be new options down the road. But as I mentioned earlier, the process of FDA approval is one of demonstrating both safety and efficacy. And in most cases, that standard has not yet been met. And also the reality is that if we look at the results of some of the trials so far, I'll focus specifically on our studies in treatment-resistant depression, a participant in that study is actually more likely not to benefit than they will benefit, especially in this very difficult to treat population. And so in many ways, that expectation, that hype, isn't warranted in terms of what's the most likely outcome. Nonetheless, the train has left the station in some ways, and it's hard not to read a newspaper or look online these days and not see something about psychedelics. And given that there are such tremendous unmet needs out there, the treatments we have to this point really are modestly effective at best in most cases. It's understandable that people would be really anxious to get access to that. Now, again, we are focused on the FDA pathway of conducting clinical trials for an FDA approval. What Holly's mentioning about expanded access or compassionate use, this is a model of access ahead of a regulatory approval, ahead of an FDA approval, under strict conditions. And some of those conditions are things like there's not an acceptable or satisfactory alternative treatment available to the patient. They're not eligible to enroll in the clinical trials, that there is sufficient preliminary evidence of safety and efficacy demonstrated in order to justify the potential risks, that there is sufficient data to guide a dose to be given within that study, as well as still a regulatory approval of having that kind of program, and typically at the institutional level, an ethics approval, an institutional review board approval, et cetera. So it is a complex process. That type of access does come with its own risks. At the patient level, potential safety risks, because all the safety questions have not yet been answered through the approval process. And then there's also the risks that they may be disappointed, because again, the efficacy also not only hasn't been established at that point, but they may not benefit regardless. On the developer side, there are potential risks of either delaying or jeopardizing the regulatory approval process. And given the ultimate aims of creating broader and equitable access for a large population that's waiting, that's a very heavy responsibility to weigh. So currently, Compass does not support expanded access or compassionate use programs. It's something that we continue to evaluate based upon the criteria that I mentioned. It's possible that we may not ever offer that program, and it's still not clear if we did to which patients it would be available. But again, it's something that really, I think, highlights the notion that the plural of anecdote isn't evidence. There's a lot of conversation out in the general world at this point that psychedelics are a panacea. They should be available to everyone, they treat everything, and they're safe, and we know they're safe, and so forth. But to Natalie's point in her earliest remarks, a lot of the earliest data that we have at looking at these drugs within a medical context don't meet the modern standard of well-controlled evidence. So, again, it's something that we'll continue to evaluate, but don't currently offer.
I'll go in reverse order and start where you left off and kind of go to the hype thing, because it's a big question. It's a good conversation. So one clarification is that I work for MAPS, the 501c3 nonprofit that was the whole owner and now is part owner of a public benefit corporation that's doing the pharmaceutical drug development. It was called MAPS PBC. It was recently renamed to Lykos like a wolf. And I just say that to say that, like, I don't want to speak on their behalf as far as, like, the decisions with respect to expanded access, but I can speak a little bit to the logic, which kind of echoes what a lot of what you just said, Stephen. So there's kind of maybe one thing I would add is that there are, there's a little bit of precedent really isn't the word, but like the conversation around legal access to psychedelics, for example, in a place like Canada has started through that kind of lens of lowercase e, lowercase a, expanded access, and I clarify that because in the U.S., expanded access is a term of art for a special FDA program, when expanded access for us is also just a term to expand access, so that's a bit confusing. I think you did a good job of clarifying that, though, because there's the actual expanded access program, which is what was just being described, which is kind of like this kind of hybrid middle ground, which looks a little bit like clinical treatment, it looks a little bit like research, has elements of both, and is sort of like the best and sort of the worst of both worlds, where you have to like collect the data, but it's hard to expand at a rate and at a speed that enough to actually have like, I think, a meaningful kind of population level impact. And because the amount of work to get just to the FDA with a kind of complete submission is so great that a lot of drug developers, I think, are less motivated to kind of spend that time unless there's, the dynamics are different. But because of the specific dynamics of psychedelic-assisted therapy, in particular, what was described earlier by, I think, all three of you, which is like the immense people time, it's been challenging to kind of move forward super quickly. And that's actually maybe a good little side note, which is that when it comes to the cost of care, this is really different from a lot of other drugs where like the primary volume of cost in the kind of potential future industry / economy around this, I think, is going to be people time. The drugs, I mean, that's maybe don't want to, obviously I wouldn't speak for Compass and the way that you guys are doing drug manufacture, but in general, the drugs are not super the expensive part, because if you are talking about a protocol, also what you were saying, Natalie, that like involves a lot of people time, whether or not that's sustainable, people cost money, and good care costs money. And I think a lot about, and I've used this term a lot over the years, the kind of tension between the urgency of need and quality of care. There's like this immense urgency of need, this immense awareness of the suffering. But then you think about the training. This kind of goes into the scope of practice thing. Who gets to get trained and who's appropriate to get trained, and how fast can they get trained? And like, is it okay for a bunch of 22-year-olds to like rent a cabin and go eat mushrooms by themselves, like as friends? And like, does someone need to be trained there, or can they just like support each other to like make sure they don't like get lost in the snow or something? So there's a range there. So and like different people have different perspectives, and it really is like I think an open question that depends a lot on what you were just saying, Glenn, around like what are you measuring, like what are the purposes you're doing this for, and what's the angle. I'll say a little bit more about this in my closing remarks, but I'm all about like harmonization, I'll say, which we can get more into. So that's just a little bit on the logic of how to do or not do expanded access. One other angle that I'll just flag here is right to try, which is a framework that exists more in the United States than other places. And so the difference between really compassionate use and right to try is that compassionate use or expanded access, kind of in the non-term of art sense, is really meant for kind of special populations that, like as you said, like maybe have particular considerations that make them harder to treat or harder to get access to care under the current paradigms, maybe terminal patients and so on. Is a person who is at risk of suicide terminal or not? That's different than a cancer patient. How do we split hairs around like, is someone who's dealing with a major drug dependency, is that terminal or not with the rate of overdose? You know, so there's a bunch of questions about who exactly qualifies for one of those special places. So that's one thing around kind of expanded access or compassionate use, and that's differentiated a little bit from right to try, which has some of the same things. It's like a particularly American, I would say it's kind of a libertarian concept where once a very, very, very baseline of safety, and I don't think not even efficacy, but safety has been established, in some states there's kind of points of entry for right to try, which is that like a person who fits some of these qualifications, maybe they're terminal or something else, can try something that's kind of still in an experimental phase. There's a lot of theory, I guess you could say, about whether or not that's right or wrong, but I think the main thing I just wanted to introduce here is that paradigms like that do exist. But there's a lot of incentives, or I should say there are few incentives for drug developers who are actually in the process of still collecting safety and efficacy data to let their drug out, you know, in a way that is ultimately in a less controlled setting than the clinical trials that they're used to operating in. So that's the first thing. The second, and I guess the TLDR there is that like, from our perspective, and I think from Lykos's perspective, the real focus has been like, how do you get to, you know, the proper complete submission in front of FDA? How do you go through that process without necessarily adding too many accoutrements that might kind of derail the process or that might kind of impact that regulatory process? One quick comment on the hype. This is also its own whole rabbit hole of a conversation. So, like, I think the media really likes framing psychedelics as a silver bullet. I don't think it's just the media's fault. I don't think it's just like wanting to sell papers. I think people are legitimately really desperate. I think people really legitimately do see a failure of the current existence of the treatment scheme in offering support. That's not just like a political thing. I think people are actually underserved by the existence of the system as it is. Everything from the treatments themselves to the kind of framework of the system, as you were saying earlier, Stephen, the way that U.S. healthcare has developed. The conversation about integrating psychedelics into mental health in the United States is radically different than a place with universal healthcare. And like everything from why we're talking about payers in the first place to who gets access to which populations are prioritized, all of those questions are different when you're not talking about the primary burden of primary burden of cost being on the individual or on an employer. So that's a whole thing, but I say that to say that like this hype machine factor is a very real one, and I think from the perspective of either those of us here on this panel, but also people who are working in the field, trying to back off of the kind of evangelist ledge and really holding the full space for like the actual risks, not just the ones that we've been kind of conditioned to hearing for the last 50 years because of propaganda, the last 500 years because of racism and colonialism. But actually, like, where are the actual risks? Where do they actually land? Can we just have an honest conversation about them for once, please? And I do think that we are moving in that direction, where there's a little bit more nuance and a willingness to do that. So just saying that, like, I sometimes worry that the hype and both the hype and the desperation outpace not just our ability to create, like, the appropriate treatment paradigms and infrastructure, but also the cultural paradigms and infrastructure. Maybe I'll say a little bit more about this in my closing comments, but there's a lot of like macro, like ontological and ideological and cosmological things that are implicated by psychedelics, which are in many ways part of not just integrating your life into a better world, but disintegrating worldviews that cause us to have certain habits that have downstream effects on depression and anxiety and PTSD and so on and so on. So I just want to say that this is both this like kind of medical indication diagnosis question, and it's also a much larger one around like what happens when you bring an entire new class of drugs, and not just like in the shadows, but into kind of a regulated paradigm that has all of the channels of an industrial program where you have incentives to make money, you have incentives to manufacture in different ways, and so on. So, yeah.
Okay, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for audience questions. So let me just ask one more question before we turn things over to you, acknowledging that we're here in a law school. I wanted to give Glenn and Ismail the opportunity to talk about what role lawyers should expect to play in this emerging ecosystem.
Good question. Still, no love. Okay, that's fine. I'll take yours.
Great.
Or maybe this just means I want to hear more from you than from me, right? So this is the
just
subtle signal.
sentence and go back.
I'll be okay, right? So they will sue to bust the patents or try to bust the patents, right? They will bring claims against the DEA claiming religious freedom exemptions and claiming that DEA is sitting on petitions for a long time. They will bring lawsuits against clinicians for medical malpractice for failing to supervise in appropriate ways. They will challenge licensure requirements and challenge export requirements and all sorts of other stuff, claiming all sorts of constitutional theories. And they will be the ones who design most of the systems in most of the state and local things and tell them why they shouldn't do it the way they're going to do it, and then they'll probably do it anyways. That's what the lawyers are going to do.
You're going to have our clinicians shaking over there.
That was-
They already said they were scared.
That was honestly great, and I was almost going to start first. I'll give a more optimistic view. I mean, you're not wrong. I think that you're totally right about literally all of that. I was just going to say that I think that so lawyers get to know the words, whether we like it or not. We get to know the words, we get to know the terms of art, and I think we get to have a lot of influence in the definitions and how things are defined. And the more I spend time in this space, I graduated from law school 8 or 9 years ago and started working in this field immediately, kind of right place, right time, and found that, and still find that, the kind of inconsistency of terms really, really impacts like how we think about the design of these programs. There's a whole bunch of terms of art that like have definitions that are defined by whether it's the regulatory systems or these institutions or so on. And I think a lot of the fights around how those things are applied goes directly to what you were just saying. Like, how do we know, like, and I'm thinking in particular, maybe I guess the best example is that there's a gap between what can be put into law or code and then what actually happens. There's always a gap. I don't think that there's any version of reality where like any state regulatory model or agency regulatory model or rulemaking process or scope of practice or system or standard operating procedure or so on or ethics code can actually cover every single possible thing that could ever happen forever. Thank God. So I think so much of this kind of open to interpretation-ness means that lawyers and legal professionals have a lot of responsibility there and this is me bringing my own editorializing in now, to think of our interests, not just kind of conflict of interest in a legal sense, which I think is a really important thing, obviously, to disclose, and there's mechanisms for that. But I like thinking a lot about legal professionals and the ideologies that we bring with what are the kind of the aspects of our culture and society that we take to be as default, and the opportunity here to do a little bit of wiggle waggle on the edges to understand like how do psychedelics both like as a concept and then both in practice, whether it's in medicine or beyond, allow us to actually think a little bit differently about how these regulatory systems operate. The mere fact of bringing in this human element. Sometimes I think that this aspect of like human therapy assisting a psychedelic drug is as radical or even more radical than the fact that we're taking a Schedule I drug through the process. Like the implications for a therapy medicine combination, I think, could be greater than the drug itself. It just so happens that the drug is Schedule I, but I'm thinking downstream like other things. So I just said it to say that I think that the biggest role in thinking, being here at the law school and thinking about myself in law school like years ago and like what I wanted to do and what I thought was important, I think that we need to find both the balance of like, yes, the law is really a service profession. It's really one that's meant to like be in service to these larger things, and it has immense power to do that kind of design. And when we're thinking maybe in a more optimistic sense of how to design a post-prohibition world, one that like looks beyond the current drug control scheme, which is really not just outstaying its welcome, like I was saying earlier, but proving to be less and less effective and less kind of in line with reality, with how we experience reality, with how we take in our own evidence, with science and practice and so on. I think having a little bit more of that awareness of our agency and that point of influence, I think, is actually really important. Not to just be like arms of the system as it exists, but actually recognize that with collaboration, especially multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary conversation, including ones like the one we're having here, we get to see like from a lot of different angles and hopefully design something that like will also eventually be replaced, but maybe after we get to do some good in the meantime.
Thank you. So with that, I'm going to invite questions from the audience. We don't have to run around like a talk show because you all have mics in front of you. So just make sure, since we're recording this, that you press the button on your mic. And just say your name and, very, very briefly, what brings you here, why you're interested in psychedelics. Yes.
To hold it down the whole time.
As long as the green light is on, you should be good. So yes, hold it down.
Okay. My thumb might cramp. My name is Taylor Flatt. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner. You always said nursing student, but and I work at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. I'm also one of the co-founders and director of community engagement for the Penn Psychedelics Collaborative. And my question is, you brought up briefly in special populations, pediatric considerations. And so I'm applying for my PhD right now with the hopes of being able to study pediatric populations with psychedelic assisted therapy. And I'm wondering what kind of conversations are currently being had and what your guys' perspectives are in terms of the ethical, clinical, practical considerations for working with this population.
Whoever wants to take it.
Yeah, I can start to answer that question. Probably other folks have other things to say too, but so maybe the place to start would be with MDMA, right? So MAPS has submitted their NDA. It might get approved for clinical use as soon as the end of this year. And I think, Holly, you'd mentioned earlier, right, that just because MAPS gets approval for MDMA doesn't mean that all MDMA gets approved all over the place, right? And so MAPS will have special approval for its own product. They'll have data exclusivity over all of their trial data that they've submitted. The FDA will extend that data exclusivity 6 months, I think, MAPS people, right? If you also do trials in pediatric populations and show that it's safe and effective. And so I think MAPS and other entities who are seeking clinical approval are going to be motivated to do that for that reason at minimum. We don't know too much about what happens when kids get things like MDMA. We know about like other psychedelics, right? So in some communities, like in Brazil, we have like preteen children drinking ayahuasca with their families many, many times in a given year. They seem to be okay from small studies in those groups. But we don't know, right? There's a big question about what happens when you throw this potentially brain-melting thing into a brain that's already a little melty and still needs to like solidify a little bit more. Yes. That seems, concerning. And we should probably tread kind of carefully there. There's also the question of, well, how do you explain to a kid what they're about to experience if you can't explain to an adult even, right? And how do you deal with a kid in that state and help them integrate that experience if they maybe don't have the maturity of mind to understand or grok some of those concepts? And we ran into this issue a little bit almost with our anorexia nervosa study. Even though the minimum age of enrollment was 18, we had I think like 1 or 2 19-year-olds apply, some of whom I would say were not of the highest maturity level for their age, and we had serious concerns about moving forward with them in those situations because it seemed like their parents wanted them to do this. They had no interest in getting better. What do you do when you like throw somebody like that into a situation where all of their defenses are just going out the window? So we don't quite know. I think, again, probably the first good data on this will come out of what MAPS or Compass or USONA end up doing if they want to pursue the extension of that data exclusivity. And we'll see.
Yeah, no, that's great. Just a couple other brief things I'll add is that, this really isn't a unique consideration either to psychedelics, given that with most approved drugs for psychiatric indications, they haven't been directly studied in children, yet in many cases are commonly used in pediatric populations, which is problematic. Right now, the minimum age that we are enrolling in our trials is 18. FDA always does require that you at least have a pediatric plan to in some way address the population, but not necessarily to include those below 18 in your studies. In terms of other existing data, if we look at some of the ketamine literature, and with some similarities to MDMA in the sense that it's not a classical psychedelic, but does have some subjective properties that may make it reasonable to consider it in a similar bucket. There are some small academic studies with ketamine in adolescent populations for depression and maybe OCD as well, I forget. But pretty limited. So it's a tough one.
I'll just say I'm not nearly as sure as you are that they're going to go for the extra 6 months of exclusivity, at least right away, in part because I think the PR side of this is so bad that it may not, and as Steve says, the vast majority, not just of psychiatric drugs, but of drugs in general, are not actually studied in the pediatric population.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Adrian, currently a fifth-year PhD candidate in neuroscience here at Penn and also a fellow at Palo Santo, a psychedelic therapeutics venture capital fund. And so my question is, in terms of the clinical rollout of psychedelic-assisted therapy, particularly MDMA, that might not be totally possible like in the real world in terms of the lengthy sessions, 2 therapists per session, et cetera. What are your thoughts on potential mitigation strategies like group therapy or like having them be with a therapist or the psychoactive component, but then brought to a room as a group for like until vitals return to baseline?
I love this question. Thanks for asking it. So I would probably start by waiting to see, like, I think that when people, and not saying that you're wrong, but I think when people say, like, it might not be possible, I think that that's, like, a cost factor, not that it can't be done, but that, like, whether or not a payer will cover 40-something plus hours of therapy and so on with the 2 people, like, that I think is, like, more of, like, a payment question, but as far as, like, the modality, like, it is done and can be done, but the question is, like, can it scale is really, I think, the question that people have. And I have a lot of opinions about that maybe I won't talk about so much right now. But it's a good question, though, because from a cost perspective and also just from like a practical care perspective, the conversation of group therapy has come up a lot. A number of studies have been done and are getting done right now on like what it means to be bringing psychedelics into kind of group contexts. My sense is that it depends on the indication and the context. So, for example, there are scenarios and even groups that have studied, that have been working with veterans, for example, have started to find this even when they're working like outside of the country in like legal or differently regulated scenarios in different parts of the world, where like group therapy is actually more effective, not just more cost effective, but more effective for the person's outcome. But those people often need some one-on-one care first, like going from 0 to 100 if you're in a highly traumatized environment or have a highly traumatized past may be too much too fast. So I imagine that in practice, it might end up being some sort of combination. And many of the kind of psychedelics or entheogenic practices that exist in traditional contexts have almost all entirely been in groups. I think that that's a definite thing that people are exploring, and how exactly that would apply to like the medical model is a big question. But the fact is that, again, I like that line, like many anecdotes does not make evidence or whatever it was, but like there's lots of examples globally, both in traditional shamanic practices as well as in kind of neo-shamanic, kind of emergent spaces, retreats and so on, where groups are actually a quite normal default and a lot of people benefit from them. So absolutely yes, from a cost perspective and exploration perspective, and there are group therapy trials happening, research happening right now, both with MDMA and psilocybin and certainly others, and I think there's going to be more soon. Not to mention observational stuff with things like ayahuasca. So that's one piece, and then there was a second question.
Oh, just in terms of like the idea of a patient being with a therapist.
Oh, yes, great. Thank you. So this is something I've been working for the last few years for my position at MAPS with a number of people who are kind of designing state legal programs, whether it's Oregon or Colorado, and there's probably about a dozen other states that are like in serious conversation over the last year, legislatively or otherwise, on like what would a regulatory system look like, and this question comes up a lot. especially because it kind of touches on what we were talking about earlier, which is like, is it wellness? Is it therapy? Is it medical? Is it something else? And one of the things that I'm really adamant about is not over-professionalizing integration services. I think that there may be situations where a best-case scenario is you're working with a single provider from the entire time. I know a number of practitioners who work above and underground who have different opinions about this, where sometimes they would rather be the baseline therapist and work with their own clients. In other situations, they'd rather be the person their client comes back to after working with a specialist in a particular way. So I can kind of see both. And in any case, when designing a system, I think over-professionalizing integration services would actually severely undermine the capacity for people to do follow-up. First off, there's an enforcement question. What are you going to do if someone doesn't show up to their follow-up session? What consequences are you going to have? Are you going to arrest them? Like, what are you going to do if someone doesn't show up to their integration is one thing. And in practice, like, I don't know how much like clinical evidence there is on this, but in practice, a lot of people's integration experience comes from, or benefits from integration. And by integration, for those not familiar, I really just mean like the process of like becoming aware of and integrating lessons from the psychedelics into the day-to-day life. There's a whole bunch of critique and deconstruction we can do of that. What about disintegration? But for now, I'll talk just from the more normal perspective. And what I'll say is that a lot of people experience benefit from things that aren't like talking more to their therapist. That's helpful, but it's like joining a community group or being in a circle or doing things that allow them to kind of implement in practice the things that they learn or the things that they realize that often happen in kind of civil society sessions, or like community or even family social environments, not so much like I have to talk more to the therapist. I think in a best case scenario, you have all of the above, where you do have a care team that understands like the psychopharmacology, the psychological aspect, you personally, maybe with multiple years of experience, and a community outside of that that can support. And I think this kind of increase of like psychedelic societies around the world and these organizations that are really about like non-professionalized but like peer-to-peer support services is a very practical and also realistic thing that responds to what people actually need most of the time. So yes, to having kind of a blended approach, I guess, is the kind of core point there.
So we have under 10 minutes, so I'm not going to let anybody else chime in on that question because I saw a lot of hands. So I'm going to say short questions and short answers so we can squeeze in a lot to the last few minutes. Yes.
Hi, this is not staying on. Can you hear me? I'm Claire Pouncey. I'm a psychiatrist in practice and a PhD in philosophy of science, so I do a lot of defining of things, and I think about things like informed consent and, yada, yada. So I have a comment and a question. My comment is that it is almost impossible to get Schedule II drugs prescribed through Medicaid and Medicare. So if there's any fantasy that any of these psychedelics are going to be available through government-sponsored programs, maybe the VA, but not the M's. You can just give that up right now unless there's a whole separate lobbying process, nationally and state by state. And my question is, does any of you have any idea or any thoughts about what will actually change when Agarwal is decided? And are there any hints from the Ninth Circuit?
Does anyone want to say what the case is? Okay, so I know a little bit about this case, and then you all can chime in about it. This was originally a right to try case involving an oncologist who wanted to provide psilocybin to people dying of cancer. There is a federal right to try law that basically says if you can find a company that's willing to provide their investigational drug, you can provide it to these patients pre-FDA approval without even asking FDA. So Dr. Agarwal said, I would like to use this federal right to try law, went to the DEA and said, how do I use this law? And the DEA said, that is FDA's thing. Right? The law only focused on FDA. It didn't give any pass with regard to what you have to do for DEA purposes. Long kind of procedural history through the courts. Ultimately, now what's being litigated is that Dr. Agarwal requested a rescheduling of psilocybin. And the DEA denied the petition, and the Ninth Circuit recently said to the DEA, your rationale for denying the petition was inadequate. So is your question about what will happen if the Ninth Circuit says to DEA, you must reschedule?
Also, I don't think that's what's going to happen, right? So, like, I'd be happy if it did in some ways, but I haven't thought so much about what would happen because I don't think it's going to happen. But I'm curious what other people think.
I mean, just, I don't know, speculating, spitballing. The Muir rescheduling itself isn't necessarily a path for medical access. Certainly it could lessen penalties, reduce other risk for other access pathways, but it would have no bearing on whether a product is FDA approved for a given indication. And so for that approval to happen and for that treatment to ultimately be covered by a payer, it would still require that regulatory approval. On the note about the availability of Schedule II drugs in the M's, Medicare and Medicaid, it's a very good point. I think at this point it's still unclear which schedule MDMA, psilocybin, other psychedelics may land on. I think many are hoping and somewhat expecting probably Schedule III, not Schedule II. Ultimately, at least in the case, I don't know if this is going to apply to MDMA, but at least for psilocybin with the indication of treatment-resistant depression, it falls under the 6 protected classes. Antidepressants are a protected class, and therefore CMS must provide coverage. But certainly access to Schedule II drugs is in some ways more restrictive than Schedule III. Yeah.
Let's see if we can get one more. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Athika Ismail. I'm a child psychiatrist, also forensic psychiatrist, right down the street at CHOP. My question is kind of along the lines of informed consent, and I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but have there been any discussions in terms of almost guaranteeing kind of access to this medication in populations that require like treatment over objection or involuntary use? Because if we're kind of getting to that point, most people are treatment resistant or sick enough to require treatment over objection. So I don't know if that topic has come up in terms of informed consent or if anyone's discussing it.
I have been predicting since like 2018 that this issue was going to come up, and I see this as a hell world scenario. truly, because like the idea of forcing psychedelics on someone is like truly such a worst case scenario outcome that one of the reasons I'm worried about the hype that we were talking about earlier is that it becomes so integrated that that falls into the realm of possibility. I would love to talk to you or talk to someone who knows more about this because it's something I've been tracking for a while. I don't necessarily see that as being possible like in the short term because of all of the resistance, but we think a lot about like recidivism and criminalized people in particular, and like what happens when people are suddenly forced into treatment like in carceral settings. And just from like, again, I'm not a medical professional, but my many years of experience in the field shows me that the healing, let's say you will use that soft word right now, that's possible if any exists, does not just come from like being able to do a drug in a particular context, but has so much to do with like the agency of the individual and their willingness and interest to participate in a form of transformational change themselves, not to get too woo-woo or anything, but it's true. And I think that is I love that you brought it up. I hate that it's something we have to think about, but I would love to be more in dialogue because I don't know very much about like what are the things that are required to lead to to kind of involuntary treatment sort of scenario. And it's something I worry about a lot. It's part of the reason I'm like, hold your horses. Like this is exciting, but not so exciting that we need to force it on people.
I'll also say it's very fluid and every jurisdiction has their own laws. So it's really hard. It's probably hard to predict unless you're in a specific kind of area and working just in that area. So.
Okay. Well, we have like 1 minute left, and now I'm going to ask our panelists. This is stealing Glenn's idea, but I love it, which is what is your tweet-length summation, your key takeaway that you hope everybody in this room walks away remembering about psychedelics and regulation? Who wants this? Glenn, you start. It's your idea.
My idea, so I'll start. Here's the tweet. Ready? Ready for the cynicism? Unless the government says otherwise, the clinical model will follow the business model, not vice versa.
I might break the character limit here a little bit, but some colleagues of mine published a paper about the hype cycle, sort of drawing this figure, right, of this peak of the hype, and the eventual trough of disillusionment, and then the plateau later of like normalcy of some sort. So I think we're still very much at the peak. I think we'll probably approach the trough whenever, like maybe within the year after MDMA is approved. And then we'll see all sorts of weird outcomes from the states that are legalizing all of this stuff on their own. And then, a lot of people will be hurt. I think that's unfortunately going to be a fact of life, that people have bad outcomes, psychosis, mania, a lot of stuff that we're already seeing in the news a little bit of. But eventually we'll find our way.
Patients are waiting. Hopefully, at some point in the near future, we will have some new options to offer them.
I'll just flag harmonization. I think that all of the policy frameworks are possible and can exist in parallel. I'm really curious about many on-ramps and many off-ramps, many on-ramps for different kinds of populations and different needs, and many off-ramps for when things go wrong and support for exists. So I think that's the key thing, that we can actually harmonize. These are not mutually exclusive contexts.
All right, well, this was just as wonderful as I knew it would be, having you all together. So please join me in thanking our panelists.